There's something very specific and very messy about watching a woman walk away from a rich tech CEO and straight into a marriage with a man everyone thinks is a beggar, only for him to secretly be a missing Hollywood superstar. It hits that fantasy nerve, but it also pokes at class, ego, and how cruel people can be when they think you're at the bottom. That mix is what makes Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar, a 2026 drama, so strangely addictive and frustrating at the same time. And that's what I want to unpack with you today. You're hanging out with me on Flick Flare. And if you like long, nerdy drama breakdowns and emotional overthinking about fictional couples, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. I'm going full spoilers here, from the contract marriage setup all the way to the identity reveal and the fall of all the backstabbers. So if you want to go in completely fresh, watch the show first and then come back. For everyone else, let's talk about why this drama works, where it falls flat, and why this particular flavor of fantasy is so powerful if you've ever felt humiliated or underestimated. On the surface, Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar looks like one of those classic Cinderella twist melodramas. We've got Rachel, our hardworking, soft-hearted lead who's constantly being told she's not enough. We've got Richard, the arrogant ex who's rich, polished, and convinced money makes him superior. And then there's Sean Norton, a top-tier actor who vanishes from Hollywood, reappears as a homeless man, and refuses to go back to that world. The moment you find out Sean is actually insanely wealthy and famous, you realize you're not in pure realism anymore. You're in modern fairy tale territory. The question is, does the show use that setup to say something meaningful about dignity and love, or is it just wish fulfillment with pretty faces? The show opens right in the emotional chaos of Rachel's life. Her grandmother is dying. Her mother and family are clinging to this last hope. They want to see Rachel married before Christmas. It's not about money or status for them. It's about tradition, a sense of completion, the idea that their girl is settled. Rachel, being the responsible one, has done everything right. She's engaged to Richard, a director at a successful tech company, someone her family believes is a dream. She reassures her grandmother on the phone that everything is fine, that the wedding is happening, that they'll register soon. You can hear the panic under those words, because you know life is never that neat. And right on cue, the rug gets pulled. When Rachel goes to Richard's workplace, expecting a normal day and maybe some wedding talk, she literally walks into a nightmare. She finds out Richard has been cheating on her with her cousin Jessica. That's not just betrayal, that's double betrayal. Family and fiancé both stabbing her in the back in one blow. And the show doesn't underplay that humiliation. Jessica throws Rachel's job and status in her face, straight up calls her lesser because she doesn't have money and prestige. It's that very pointed, very recognizable class cruelty. You should be grateful for scraps from us. What makes this sequence hit is Rachel's response. She doesn't just cry, she calls Jessica out. She points out how Jessica has been taking from her since they were kids: food, toys, attention, and now even her fiancé. That line, about Jessica always taking what she loves, is simple but sharp. It instantly builds a history between them without needing a long flashback montage. You feel that this is not just about Richard. This is about a lifetime of being second place in her own life. I want to come back to this idea later when we talk about how the show handles family, because that's one of its more interesting threads. Things escalate when Richard, the supposed decent guy, doesn't just stand there quietly. He chooses Jessica. He actually raises his hand and hits Rachel to defend Jessica. That moment is a hard line for a lot of viewers. Some of you will instantly be like, I'm out, this is too melodramatic. But honestly, I think the show needed that ugly, literal violence to make the break between them irreversible. When Richard then trashes the engagement ring, mocks it, and tells Rachel to kneel and beg forgiveness, basically demanding she accept humiliation as the price of love, it crosses into almost cartoon villainy. But it captures something very real about some controlling relationships: the expectation that you will accept being degraded if you want to keep the relationship. Right when Rachel refuses, when she has that tiny core of pride that says, I would rather lose everything than kneel for you, the story quietly introduces its other central relationship. Rachel and the beggar she's been kind to, Shoin. Up to this point, Shoin has been almost background. This ragged man she's given food, maybe some small talk, a human connection when everyone else stares right through him. There's something really important in how the show frames this. Rachel is only person who sees Shoin as human when the world thinks he's worthless. That's the emotional foundation for everything that comes later. Here's where the drama starts playing its big fantasy card. Rachel's engagement is shattered. She's facing her grandmother's death, her mother's expectations, and now she's got nothing to show them except a broken promise. Socially, culturally, that's a lot of weight. The show makes it very clear that Rachel is not just sad, she's crushed by shame, like she failed her family. And in the middle of that emotional collapse, Shoin, the man everyone calls a beggar, steps up and offers to marry her. Not as a grand romantic proposal, but as a practical, almost desperate solution. What I like in this setup is that the marriage is explicitly framed as a contract. Rachel lays it out. She wants a beautiful wedding for her mom and grandmother to witness, a photo, a moment, a lie that they can hold on to. In return, she's promising Shoin they'll divorce later. It's kind of cold and heartbreaking. She's not marrying for love. She's marrying to protect the people she loves from disappointment, and she's using herself as a tool to do it. If you've ever sacrificed your own comfort just to keep the peace in your family, this hits hard. At the same time, this is where the drama might lose some of you logically. The idea that a homeless man is your best option for a fake marriage, that this is the only plan she can come up with, is obviously heightened and contrived. It's not supposed to be realistic problem solving, it's mythic. Rachel, abandoned by the rich, chooses the bottom of the barrel in the eyes of society. And that bottom turns out to be pure gold. If you fight that logic too hard, you're going to be annoyed. If you accept it as a fairy tale engine, it's actually kind of fun. Now, what makes Shoin interesting is that he doesn't jump at the chance to get back into the spotlight, and he doesn't flaunt his real identity to Rachel. He's a superstar who has been missing for 6 months, hiding as a vagrant, dodging calls to return to the industry. That backstory opens up so many questions. What broke him? What kind of games in the industry is he refusing to play anymore? The show doesn't answer all of them immediately, but it gives you enough to understand he's deeply disillusioned. He's not just rich and powerful. He's traumatized and exhausted, and hiding in rags is his way of opting out. Here's a small confession from me as a viewer. The first time Shoin offered to marry Rachel, I actually paused my screen. Not because it was shocking, we all knew the contract marriage was coming, but because I was surprised at how gentle he was in that moment. He's not doing the cocky, I'll save you, hero posture. He's soft-spoken, a little hesitant, like he's worried she'll feel insulted. That tiny choice in performance made me think, oh, okay, this isn't going to be just a jerk-turn-soft storyline. He already has a conscience. It made me more willing to go along with the wild premise. Shoin's decision to keep his identity hidden from Rachel is the core tension of the first stretch of the drama. From one angle, it's sweet. He doesn't want her to care about him because of his fame or money. He wants to protect the sincerity of how she sees him. From another angle, it's deception, and it sets up an inevitable trust crisis once the truth comes out. The drama asks you to be okay with him lying for what he believes is the right reason. Whether you buy that or not is going to seriously affect how you feel about their relationship later. There's a key sequence at the marriage registration office that kind of encapsulates the show's whole vibe. Rachel and Shoin, dressed simply, walk in like any other couple. Rachel is nervous, half expecting to be judged because she's marrying someone who looks like he has nothing. There's this subtle social tension in the room. People glance at Shoin, his clothes, the faint smell of the street on him. And you can see Rachel's shoulders tighten in embarrassment and protectiveness. And then the clerk looks up, freezes, and you see recognition flash across his face. After 6 months of mystery, the missing Hollywood star is standing in front of him, holding a marriage form. I love how this scene plays out, because the show uses it almost like a mini explosion of its core fantasy. In a single instant, the power dynamic flips. The beggar is actually the most powerful man in the room. You don't even need dialogue to feel the shift. You see it on the clerk's face, in the stutter of his voice, in the way he suddenly treats Shoin with this over-the-top politeness. The room's gaze changes from pity to awe. Rachel, meanwhile, is just confused. She thinks people are being weird because of her unglamorous appearance or because of class prejudice. She has no idea this is her husband's world bleeding through the costume he's been wearing. The choice to have the staff recognize Shoin right at the legal moment of marriage is symbolically neat too. That's the second when their fake relationship becomes real in the eyes of the law. And it's also the second when Shoin's lie is at the highest risk of being exposed. The show milks that tension. Will they call security? Will someone scream, "It's him"? Will Rachel's plan collapse before it even starts? The fact that the registration still goes through, that the system legitimized their union while the truth about Shoin hangs by a thread, gives the whole thing a slightly surreal feeling. If you're into dramatic irony, this drama really spoils you. Rachel is constantly making choices based on the assumption that Shoin is poor, powerless, and vulnerable. She defends him when others insult him, she worries about his future, she tries not to burden him, and she feels guilty dragging him into her family mess. From our vantage point, you're watching a woman worried about protecting a man who could buy the entire building they're standing in. There's something enduring in that, but also something quietly tragic, because you know the imbalance of information is going to hurt her later. Let's talk about the love story that grows out of this mess, because the contract is only the starting point. One of the better decisions the drama makes is not to rush Rachel into falling in love the moment she signs the papers. She starts with gratitude, guilt, and a sense of responsibility. She's using Shoin to solve a problem, yes, but she also feels like she owes him a real attempt at decency within the lie. That means she tries to be a good wife in the small ways she can manage. Cooking, sharing her space, caring about his day, defending his dignity in front of her judgmental relatives. Shoin, on the other hand, is falling from the moment she offers him this strange lifeline. As a superstar, he's used to people wanting things from him, roles, connections, money, clout. Rachel is the only one who sat with him on the curb when he looked like nothing, brought him food because he was hungry, not because his Instagram followers might repost her kindness. When she turns around and says, "Marry me, but we can divorce later," you can see him processing the fact that she still doesn't know who he is and still chooses him. That's powerful. It gives his feelings for her a grounded, grateful depth that makes their eventual romance feel more than just hot rich guy falls for average girl. There's one mini scene that really sticks with me when I think about how the show sells their bond. Picture this. It's night, they're back from the exhausting registration day. Rachel is sitting on the floor of her tiny living room, still in the clothes she wore for the fake wedding. The dress isn't glamorous. It's simple, slightly wrinkled. Her makeup is smudged from tears and stress. The sounds of the city drift through the thin walls, motorbikes, distant laughter, a dog barking 3 floors down. She's holding her phone, looking at a photo of her grandmother smiling weakly from a hospital bed, dressed up with a little flower in her hair for the big day. Rachel's hand is shaking because she knows everything her grandmother is happy about is built on a lie. Shoin comes in quietly, carrying 2 steaming cups of instant coffee. He sets one down beside her and doesn't say anything at first. The camera lingers on his face as he looks at the photo over her shoulder. You can see the conflict there, the urge to fix everything with the truth, the fear that the truth will break this fragile, precious moment her grandmother is clinging to. Finally, he says, in this low, steady voice, something like, She looks really happy. You did that. And Rachel just breaks. She starts crying, the ugly kind, gasping for air. And she keeps saying, "It's fake. It's fake. I lied to her." Sean doesn't argue. He doesn't say, "But we're really married, so it's fine." He just wraps his arms around her and lets her fall apart against his chest. The camera pulls back slightly, the city noise softens, and for a second you feel like they're the only two people in the world who understand this exact pain. That's the kind of quiet, earned intimacy that makes their relationship feel real. At this point, you might be wondering, where does the superstar aspect really come in beyond the initial hook? Does the show actually explore celebrity culture and industry corruption? Or is it just a shiny label slapped on a standard rich guy? The answer is a bit of both. And this is where my feelings about the drama get more mixed. On the positive side, Sean's refusal to go back to the industry isn't just a quirky character trait. The show suggests he's seen and experienced pretty dark things in that world: manipulation, image control, maybe even exploitation that left him with a deep distrust of everyone around him. He talks about their games with this bitterness that implies a long history of being used, that gives weight to his decision to disappear for 6 months and live like someone with nothing. It's almost like he's trying to burn his old identity to the ground. However, the drama doesn't always commit to that darker, more thoughtful angle. There are stretches where Sean's fame is treated like a superpower instead. Whenever the plot needs a boost, someone recognizes him or a past contact appears, and suddenly he can fix things with a signature or a phone call. That's fun in a revenge fantasy way, especially when it comes time to deal with Richard and Jessica. But it can undercut the earlier, more nuanced critique of the entertainment industry. I kind of wish the show had the courage to linger longer on why Sean hates that world, rather than just using it as a convenient resource bank. Let's circle back to Rachel's ex, Richard, because he's an important part of how the show frames class and dignity. Richard is not just a random bad boyfriend, he's a symbol. He's the guy who thinks money automatically makes him better than everyone else. He hits Rachel, demands her submission, and implies that a woman without his level of wealth should just be grateful for whatever crumbs he throws at her. That's intense, and it sets him up as a pretty one-note villain for most of the run. Here's where I'm going to drop a slightly contrarian take. While a lot of viewers really hate Richard, and I get it, I actually think the drama misses an opportunity by making him so flatly monstrous early on. If he had even a tiny sliver of decency at the beginning, if we saw why Rachel once loved him, it would sting more when he betrays her. As it is, he's almost cartoonishly awful from the moment we meet him in that confrontation scene. That satisfies the part of us that wants to yell trash at the screen, but it doesn't challenge us emotionally. Then again, I know some of you love having a pure villain to direct all your rage at, and for that purpose Richard absolutely delivers. Jessica, Rachel's cousin, is a different flavor of antagonist. Her cruelty is rooted in jealousy and entitlement. The way she mocks Rachel's job and lifestyle, the way she seems to derive pleasure from taking what Rachel cherishes, feels less like simple greed and more like a lifelong competition only she is playing. When Rachel accuses her of always taking what she loves, the show is hinting at years of emotional theft, maybe Jessica copying her, undermining her, trying to steal whatever attention Rachel got from the family. That's an interesting psychological dynamic that, again, I wish the show leaned into more. There's a version of this story where Jessica is a tragic mirror of Rachel. Same upbringing, different responses to scarcity and insecurity. But mostly, she's used as a vehicle for drama and cruelty. I want to talk about one specific kind of scene that Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar repeats in different forms: the public humiliation turned rescue. We see Rachel being mocked, belittled, or cornered in some social setting, often with Richard, Jessica, or other people who look down on her. And then Sean, the man they think is a beggar, steps in. Sometimes it's quiet, he stands next to her, refuses to leave, makes it clear she's not alone. Sometimes it's more confrontational. He challenges an insult, draws a line, or later, when his identity starts to leak, simply existing in his full superstar power becomes the ultimate clapback. These scenes are very cathartic. I won't lie, there's a particular joy in watching people who treated him like dirt suddenly fall over themselves to apologize when they realize he's rich and famous. It's petty, but it taps into that deep fantasy of the tables turning of every person who ever humiliated you having to eat their words in public. The show knows exactly what it's doing here. These moments are designed as cheering fuel. But there's also something worth questioning about how often the drama relies on wealth as the ultimate vindication. On one level, it's saying, look, you were wrong to judge him as a beggar. He's actually valuable. On another, it risks implying that the reason he deserves respect is because he's secretly rich, not because he is a human being. That's why the early scenes of Rachel being kind to Sean before she knows his identity are so crucial. They're the moral anchor. Without them, this could easily become a story that equates dignity with bank accounts. Visually, the drama leans hard into contrast. Whenever Sean is in beggar mode, the lighting is a little harsher. The colors more muted, grays, browns, the kind of dirty, washed-out palette that signals hardship. When you see flashbacks or glimpses of him as a superstar, red carpets, photo shoots, interviews, the screen pops with saturated colors, polished frames, and smooth camera moves. The direction wants you to feel the whiplash between his two worlds. Sometimes, maybe a little too much. The rich world sequences can look almost like perfume commercials compared to the grounded, slightly grimy texture of Rachel's everyday life. The editing rhythm is interesting too. Early on, when Rachel's world is collapsing and Sean is still half a mystery, the show uses relatively quick cuts, jumping between hospital scenes, workplace confrontations, street corners, and cramped apartments. That pace sells the chaos of her life. As the contract marriage settles into a strange kind of domesticity, the editing slows down. More lingering shots in their small shared space, more quiet scenes where not much happens in terms of plot, but a lot happens in terms of micro-expressions and emotional proximity. Some viewers might find those stretches slow, especially if you're here mainly for the revenge and reveal. But personally, I think those moments are where you actually see why these two people matter to each other. The music backs that up. The OST leans into melodrama. Of course, swelling strings when the grandmother talks about her last wish, piano arpeggios under monologues about pride and pain. But the score does something nice with Sean's dual identity. When he's in beggar mode, there's often a softer, more acoustic texture. Guitar, gentle percussion, a kind of wistful, wandering theme. When his superstar past intrudes, the music shifts, more polished production. Maybe a pop ballad or a track that sounds like something from his fictional filmography. It's a simple trick, but it reinforces the sense that he's living between two soundtracks, two lives. One thing I appreciate is how the show handles Rachel's relationship with her mother and grandmother. It could have gone full caricature, overbearing, guilt-tripping elders pressuring her to marry. Instead, you get a sense that they genuinely love her and genuinely believe marriage is a gift, a protection, not a cage. The grandmother's wish to see Rachel married before she dies is touching because it's not framed as, so people don't talk about us. It's more, I want to know you'll have someone when I'm gone. You can argue with that worldview, but it feels heartfelt. At the same time, the weight of that expectation clearly suffocates Rachel. There are quiet shots of her alone after talking to her grandmother, where she forces a smile for the call, and then the second it ends, her face just collapses. Those shots hit harder than some of the shouting confrontations because they show the cost of being the good daughter. She's lying, breaking herself in half to give her family peace. And the show doesn't pretend that's noble without consequences. You see it eating away at her sense of self. I'll be honest, there were moments midway through where I got a little frustrated with Rachel's passivity. She forgives people quickly, She internalized blame that isn't hers. When Richard and Jessica circle back into her life and start interfering again, because of course they do, it takes her a long time to bite back in a meaningful, sustained way. That can be hard to watch if you're used to more assertive, quippy heroines who roast their ex into dust. But I also think Rachel is meant to represent a very real kind of person. The conflict-avoidant caretaker who will tolerate a frightening amount of disrespect before finally snapping. Whether you find her relatable or infuriating will depend a lot on your own temperament. Sean's arc, meanwhile, is about reclaiming agency on his own terms. He starts as this withdrawn, almost ghost-like figure hiding in plain sight, refusing every lure back to fame. His initial motivation for marrying Rachel is a mix of gratitude and curiosity. She saw him when no one else did. But the marriage drags him out of his self-imposed isolation. Suddenly he's meeting her family, defending her, making decisions that matter to someone else's life. That sense of purpose is what slowly pulls him back to confronting his past. The show is essentially saying, love, or even just responsibility to someone you care about, is what can make a burned-out person decide to re-engage with the world. Now, we can't ignore the big turning point hanging over everything. The full revelation of Sean's identity, not just to random clerks or industry people, but to Rachel, to her family, and crucially, to Richard and Jessica. We know from the premise that when his identity is revealed, all the traitors are destroyed and the fake marriage becomes eternal love. That's the promise. So, how does the drama handle that shift without making it feel like a cheap magic trick? The build-up is actually handled with more restraint than I expected. There are near misses. Of course, TV reports in the background about a missing star, half-glimpsed posters, people on the street whispering, "Doesn't he look like?" Rachel is always one step away from connecting the dots, but life keeps distracting her. You can read that as plot convenience, but it also mirrors how we sometimes don't see what's right in front of us, especially when we've put someone in a specific mental box. To Rachel, Sean is the kind beggar who married me, and it takes a lot to crack that label. When the truth finally hits her, it's not just shock, it's betrayal. This is something I really respect about the drama. It doesn't let Sean off the hook just because his lie was for love or for her own good. Rachel is furious, and not just in a surface way. She has to process the fact that her entire sense of their relationship, of their power dynamic, was built on a false premise. She thought she was protecting him from judgment from her family. In reality, he was in a position to protect her all along and chose not to share that. That hurts. It's not just, "You're rich and you didn't tell me." It's, "You didn't trust me enough to tell me who you really are." The ensuing conflict between them is one of the stronger emotional sequences in the show. Rachel calls him out. Was she some kind of experiment? Did he marry her to feel like a good person? Was this all a play for some twisted authenticity so he could feel like a real human again? Sean, for his part, isn't defensive in a loud, macho way. He looks devastated, like he genuinely didn't calculate this outcome. He tries to explain that he wanted one person in his life who loved him without the fame, without the money, and that he was terrified that telling her would poison that purity. It's a selfish but deeply human fear. Their fight forces the drama to actually confront its own fairy tale premise. Up until then, a lot of the fun comes from the gap between what Rachel thinks is true and what the audience knows. Once that gap closes, it has to answer. Is love built on an illusion still love once the illusion is gone? The show's answer, of course, is yes, but only after struggle. Over time, Rachel comes to understand that Sean's life wasn't about looking down on her. It was about his own self-loathing and fear. Forgiving him doesn't mean pretending the hurt never happened. It means choosing to believe that the person standing in front of her now, stripped of costume and secrets, is worth another shot. While their relationship is navigating that crisis, the external revenge engine finally kicks into full gear. Sean, reclaimed as a superstar, starts turning his power outward. The people who humiliated Rachel when they thought she was just a nobody with a beggar husband suddenly feel the ground shift under them. Richard and Jessica, who once mocked her for clinging to a poor man, are faced with the reality that the man they scorned has infinitely more status and wealth than they do. Career opportunities slip through their fingers. Their own reputations get tangled in scandals or business failures. The show doesn't hold back on the karmic payback. Watching that, there's a part of you that just wants to sit back with popcorn and enjoy the show. The office gossips who sneered at Rachel, now desperate to be invited to events with Sean. Extended family members who dismissed her trying to rewrite history, claiming they always believed in her. Richard may be losing a key deal because a company would rather work with Sean's production connections. Jessica discovering that being pretty and vicious isn't enough when the tide of public opinion turns. It's very all your enemies will see you dining with king's energy. But this is also where the show's messaging gets a little muddled. And I think it's worth interrogating if you care about what these stories say underneath the fun. The tagline idea is that all the traitors are destroyed and the fake marriage becomes eternal love. That's satisfying visually. Bad people get punished, good girl gets prince. But life isn't that clean. The danger with this kind of narrative is that it can reinforce a fantasy where the only way to win against cruelty is to marry into massive wealth and fame. If you don't get your secret billionaire, are you just stuck being humiliated forever? The drama doesn't really address that because it's operating in wish fulfillment mode. That said, I don't think the show is completely cynical. At its heart, the emotional victory is not just that Rachel ends up with a superstar. It's that the person she loved when he was nothing turns out to be far more than anyone imagined, and he uses that power, by the end, in a way that reflects the values she showed him on the street: kindness, empathy, loyalty. The revenge angle works best when it's framed as him aligning his public power with a private moral compass he learned from her. I also want to touch on something that might not be everyone's focus, but really colored my experience. The way the camera often stays on Rachel's face during these big reveal and revenge moments rather than on Sean. The directing could have easily gone full male-led worship. Slow pans, hero shots, dramatic close-ups of Sean walking into rooms like a god. And there's some of that, don't worry. But frequently, the emotional point of view shot stays with Rachel as she watches the world flip. You see confusion, discomfort, vindication, and even a little grief all mixed together. Because as much as it's fun to see her ex get wrecked, there's also a sense of loss for the simpler life she thought she wanted. In a way, recognizing Sean as a superstar marks the end of an era for Rachel. She can't go back to being just another office worker with a low-key life. She's tied herself to someone whose existence is permanently public, scrutinized, amplified. The drama hints at that tension, but doesn't fully dwell in it, which is a shame because there was room to explore what it means to lose anonymity as the price of a fairy tale ending. Still, the glimpses we do get, paparazzi outside their house, strangers commenting on her looks, the pressure to fit his world, are enough to suggest that the happily ever after is not as simple as moving into a mansion and never worrying again. Before I wrap this part of the breakdown up, don't worry. We're not concluding overall, just pausing one angle. I have to admit one small aside as a watcher of way too many contract marriage dramas. I always laugh a little at how easily everyone seems to manipulate legal marriage and divorce like changing outfits. You want to fix a family problem? Marriage. Need to boost public image? Marriage. Want to lie to a dying relative? Marriage. Meanwhile, I'm over here trying to unsubscribe from a random newsletter. And that alone feels more complicated than half these drama wedding scenes. But that's the genre. We accept the exaggeration because it gives us intense emotional stakes in a compressed timeline. From here, the really interesting questions for me are about craft. How consistent is the writing in tracking Rachel and Sean's emotional journey? Do the side characters add dimension or just noise? Does the show earn its big dramatic payoffs? Or does it lean too hard on coincidences and spectacle? And underneath the gloss, What is Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar actually saying about love, money, and self-worth when all the glitter settles? For me, it really comes down to how well the show tracks consequences. You can throw all the shocking twists and fairy tale setups you want at the screen, but if people's emotions don't respond in a way that feels at least emotionally truthful, the whole thing collapses. Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar is surprisingly good at following through on the emotional fallout of big reveals in the central romance, but much looser when it comes to everything orbiting around that core. It's like the writers were laser-focused on Rachel and Sean, and then a bit more casual about the rest. Take the structure. The early stretch is packed. Breakup, betrayal, dying grandmother's wish, sudden marriage contract, secret identity. There's barely time to breathe, and that works because Rachel's life is in freefall. Then, instead of trying to one-up itself immediately with bigger and bigger shocks, the show actually slows down. We get sequences of them living together, tiptoeing around each other, learning how each person takes their coffee, how they react to stress. That middle phase is the show's heartbeat. It's quieter, but it's where the relationship gains enough texture that later melodrama matters. Where the pacing starts to wobble is when the drama tries to widen out into subplots, Rachel's workplace, tech industry intrigues through Richard, Sean's management, and the entertainment world, extended family politics. On paper, it's great to have all those threads. It makes the world feel fuller, gives the leads more to do than stare at each other and cry. In practice, though, not every thread lands with equal weight. There are definitely a few runs of episodes where you can feel scenes being stretched just to give side characters something to do, rather than because those scenes are truly pushing Rachel or Sean forward. One example is the repeated pattern of Rachel facing humiliation in professional or social settings where Richard's shadow looms large. Early on, those scenes carry a tone of charge because each insult she swallows is fresh. The first time a coworker sneers that she couldn't hold onto a man like Richard or laughs at her beggar husband, the injustice burns. By the fourth or fifth variation, though, you start thinking, okay, I get it, everyone's trash. It's a tricky balance. You want to show systemic contempt, not just one villain, but too much repetition risks desensitizing the viewer. On the flip side, when the show leans into Sean's internal conflict, being pulled back towards the industry he hates, it usually finds a more compelling rhythm. His story has a built-in ticking clock. You know he can't stay anonymous forever. The world is looking for him. Every time his old life creeps closer, whether it's an agent calling, a news report playing in the background, or someone on the street double-taking when they walk past him, it adds a little more pressure. Those moments are small, but they add up, and the show's editing often punctuates them with these tight, quiet close-ups on his hands tightening or his jaw clenching instead of dramatic music cues. It's more subtle than you'd expect in a show with this title. A lot hinges on the performances, obviously. The actor playing Sean has to believably inhabit three versions of the same man. The charismatic superstar from his past, the hollowed-out beggar who has opted out of everything, and the slowly reawakening husband who lets Rachel drag him back into feeling. Whenever he's in public as no one, his body language shrinks. Shoulders rounded, eyes down, movements careful and slow like he doesn't want to attract attention. In flashbacks or industry scenes, he's bigger, looser smile, sharper gaze, the kind of performative ease that people at the top of their field develop. Watching him toggle between those states makes the whole double life premise feel less like a costume gag and more like a genuine psychological split. Rachel's actress has a slightly less showy but equally demanding job. This is a character who spends a lot of time swallowing her feelings, playing the dutiful daughter, the agreeable colleague, the fine, I'm fine fiancé. The moments where she cracks, like the hospital hallway after visiting her grandmother, or in the tiny kitchen trying to cook for Sean while her hands are still trembling from an earlier confrontation, are played with a rawness that keeps her from feeling like just a saintly victim. There's this one shot where she's washing dishes, and the camera holds on her face as her polite smile just drains away once she turns from her family. It's nothing dramatic, but the micro shift from "I'm okay" to "I'm barely holding this together" says more about her life than a monologue would. Something the show does well, that not every melodrama manages, is allowing space for awkwardness between them. They don't fall into bed 2 episodes after signing the papers. They don't even fall into easy banter right away. There are silences at the dinner table, misread signals, small kindnesses that one person overanalyzes, while the other barely registers. Those little frictions are where the acting really shines. Shoin misinterprets one of Rachel's self-deprecating jokes and thinks she's mocking him. So he goes quiet, and the tension hangs there like a fog until someone finally blurts out an apology. It's these tiny, almost mundane misunderstandings that make their eventual confessions feel earned instead of scripted. If there's a performance choice I'm a bit iffy on, it's how Richard is played in the middle stretch. Early on, he's convincingly slimy and cold. Late in the game, when his life starts collapsing, there are glimpses of frantic desperation that almost humanize him. But in that big chunk in the center, he often feels stuck on one note. Arrogant sneer, condescending smirk, raised voice. That's partly a writing issue. But there were a few moments where I caught myself wishing the actor would inject something unexpected, a flicker of regret, a hint of insecurity, to suggest there's more going on in his head than ego. Again, I know some of you really enjoy having a villain you can safely hate without nuance, and for that purpose, he works. It just means the show is more blunt instrument than scalpel whenever he's involved. This brings us to side characters, because in a drama like this, the supporting cast can either depend the main themes or turn into noise. Rachel's immediate family lands mostly on the helpful side. Her mother is written as loving but traditional, often torn between wanting her daughter to be happy and wanting to fulfill the grandmother's wish at any cost. There's a warmth in her scenes with Shoin, especially once she starts to see how he cares for Rachel even without knowing his status. You get these sweet little domestic beats, her fussing over whether he's a 10, him awkwardly trying to help with chores he has obviously never done in his superstar life, that had humor and tenderness. The grandmother, of course, is the emotional anchor. Even when she's not on screen, her wish hangs over everything. The hospital room scenes are some of the most honestly affecting in the show. There are quite dignity to her performance. She's frail, but her eyes are bright and mischievous when she teases Rachel about being shy with her handsome husband. In one particularly gutting moment, she thanks Shoin for marrying her granddaughter, saying something along the lines of, "You've given an old woman peace." You can see Shoin freeze for a second, because he knows how much of that peace rests on secrecy. It's not a grand, sobbing scene, but it hits like a punch, because all the contradictions of their situation are packed into that single thank you. On the other end of the spectrum, you have some of the more cartoonish relatives and coworkers. There's the obligatory gossiping aunt, the office friend who isn't quite as supportive as she seems, the shallow manager who cares more about Shoin's face than his well-being once his identity resurfaces. These characters serve their purpose. They generate conflict, they embody social attitudes. But they're not particularly memorable beyond, "Oh, that one jerk." They also contribute to a tonal wobble sometimes, where you go from a grounded, intimate scene between Rachel and Shoin straight into a broad, almost comedic sequence of relatives fighting over wedding favors or office workers obsessing over Instagram followers. Depending on your tolerance for tonal shifts, you'll either find that refreshing or jarring. Cinematographically, one of my favorite recurring visual ideas is the way doors and thresholds are used. We see Shoin hovering in doorways a lot. At the entrance to Rachel's hospital room, outside her family home, standing on the threshold between the street and their shared apartment. The framing often keeps him partially in shadow, like he's never fully in the picture. Only later, after key emotional turning points, does the camera start showing him squarely in the middle of domestic spaces, lit warmly, as if to signal that he's finally letting himself belong. It's a subtle motive, but once you notice it, it adds an extra layer to even simple blocking choices. Lighting is also doing some quiet work with theme. Rachel's everyday world is often shot in practical, slightly harsh lighting, fluorescent bulbs in offices, the sterile whiteness of the hospital, the dim yellow of cheap apartment lamps. It feels very lived in, not glamorous. When Shoin's superstar past intrudes, even if it's just through a TV in the background, those images are always glossy, perfectly lit, almost unreal. As the story goes on and their worlds blend, you start seeing more of that cinematic lighting in Rachel's spaces too. Not in a she's upgraded to wealth way, but in a her life is being reframed way. Moments that would have been lit flat early on get a softer, more filmic look, mirroring the growth of her self-worth and her partnership with Shoin. On the music front, there's probably one main ballad you'll be hearing in your head for days after finishing. You know the type: soaring chorus, lyrics about seeing your true self, holding your hand in the dark, that sort of thing. The drama deploys it ruthlessly at key moments. Rachel's breakdowns, Shoin's near-reveal moments, their eventual reconciliation scenes. If you're allergic to obvious emotional scoring, this might feel manipulative to you. But I can't deny that a couple of those needle drops got me. There's a particularly effective use of it during a montage where Rachel and Shoin, temporarily separated after the big truth blow-up, go about their days clearly missing each other, but too stubborn or hurt to reach out. The song bridges their two lonely routines, underlining how parallel their pain is. Where the soundtrack is a bit more interesting is in its use of silence. Some of the most impactful exchanges between them are underscored by nothing. No violins, no piano, just the hum of traffic outside or the buzz of a hospital machine. They're a confrontation after Rachel first finds out Shoin's identity, where she's so stunned that she can't even raise her voice. She asks him simple, direct questions. How long have you been lying to me? Did you ever plan to tell me? The show resists the urge to drown that in music. We just sit in the tension of their breathing and the tiny background sounds. It's raw, and it shows a level of restraint you might not expect from a drama with such a high-concept hook. Thematically, the show circles a few key ideas: dignity versus status, truth versus performance, and how love complicates both. There's this recurring assertion, especially from Rachel, that people deserve respect simply because they are human, regardless of their social standing. That's why she feeds and talks to Shoin when he's on the street. She doesn't see herself as some savior. She just thinks it's basic decency. In contrast, Richard and Jessica treat status as the only currency that matters. Their entire moral framework revolves around winning at the social ladder game, even if that means stepping on other people's necks. The twist that Shoin is secretly wealthy could easily undermine Rachel's belief if the story ended up saying, look, she was right to be kind, because he turned out to be rich. Thankfully, the drama tries, in its better moments, to avoid that trap. It emphasizes that Rachel's life begins to change not the moment she marries him, but the moment she starts asserting her worth independent of anyone's money. There are scenes where she stands up to relatives, where she calls out workplace unfairness, where she refuses to let Richard re-enter her life even after he realizes how powerful Shoin is. Those choices would matter even if Shoin turned out to be genuinely penniless. The other big thematic thread is about truth and masks. Shoin has literally put on the costume of homelessness to escape the prison of celebrity. Rachel lies to her grandmother and mother to give them a sense of peace. Richard and Jessica perform this glossy, aspirational couple image while rotting morally underneath. The drama repeatedly asks, when, if ever, is it okay to lie for love? Does intention matter more than effect? Shoin believes he is protecting the purity of Rachel's feelings by hiding his identity. Rachel believes she is protecting her grandmother from heartbreak by staging a fake marriage. The show doesn't justify those lies easily. Both of them suffer because of their choices, and both have to do the hard work of apologizing and rebuilding trust. There's one scene, later on, that crystallized this. After a particularly nasty round of public exposure, tabloids, social media commentary, the whole circus, Rachel confronts Sean about the way their lives have become a spectacle. She points out that he, of all people, should have known what he was dragging her into when he let their relationship become public. He fires back that she chose him, too, that she signed up for this even if she didn't fully understand it. It's a messy conversation, and neither of them is completely right or wrong. The show allows that gray. Love doesn't magically erase the reality that they live in a world where fame and money distort everything they touch. I think one of the more quietly radical things the drama does is refuse to treat forgiveness as a single grand gesture. Rachel doesn't forgive Sean at the exact moment. He makes some sweeping declaration with flowers and paparazzi and a dramatic speech. She has smaller, more ambiguous steps towards him. Offering him tea without meeting his eyes. Not leaving the room when he walks in. Sleeping in the same space again, but back to back. There's a point where she tells him, "I'm still angry. But I miss you." That line is so simple and so human. It acknowledges that conflicting emotions can coexist, and that healing is often slow and uneven. Now, as much as I appreciate that nuance, I do think there are parts of the endgame where the show indulges a little too much in grand gestures at the expense of quieter logic. Without going into a blow-by-blow of the final episodes, let's just say there's a very public demonstration of Sean's commitment, involving his platform, his fans, and a pretty spectacular setting. It's visually gorgeous, emotionally bombastic, and if you're in the right mood it will probably have you grinning like an idiot. But if you step back and ask, would this actually make Rachel's life easier? Or is it mostly about him proving something? The answer is not entirely clear. That tension between what's emotionally satisfying to watch and what's thematically consistent is kind of emblematic of the show as a whole. Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar wants to say love sees the person, not the status. And in its best moments, it does. At the same time, it obviously revels in the fantasy of status as armor and weapon. Watching all of Rachel's doubters scramble to apologize once they realize who her husband is undeniably fun. But it also subtly reinforces the idea that the ultimate clapback to humiliation is not boundaries, or leaving, or building a life on your own terms. It's marrying someone with enough power to crush your enemies. Here's where I'll offer another slightly surprising take. I actually think the drama is at its most honest in the smaller, in-between moments, not the big revenge sequences or the romantic set pieces. The sight of Rachel and Sean eating a simple meal at a rickety table, both exhausted from very different kinds of battles, says more about what their marriage really is than any gala or press conference. The shot of Rachel slipping off her heels and massaging her sore feet in a hallway says more about the weight she carries than any shouted speech about standing tall. These details convince me the creative team understands ordinary struggle, even as they spin this enormous fairy tale around it. And I'll be real, there were also times I was just tired. Tired of seeing Rachel put in situations where she's demeaned, tired of watching Richard and Jessica slither back in yet again with some new scheme, tired of yet another scene of people reacting in horror to the revelation that the beggar is a star. I had to pause an episode at one point because I was so secondhand angry at a relative lecturing Rachel about being grateful for Richard's past generosity. That frustration isn't necessarily a flaw. It means I was invested. But the repetition does wear on you if you binge it. If you're the kind of viewer who loves dissecting the morality of these stories, there's also plenty to chew on in how the show handles punishment. The description makes it sound like all traitors are destroyed, and to a degree, that's true. They lose things they care about, their masks are ripped off. But the way those downfalls are portrayed varies a lot. Some get public humiliation, some get quiet exile, some are left in an ambiguous state where their futures are unclear. I actually like that not every antagonist is hauled off in handcuffs. It feels a bit more grounded that way. ruin can be noisy or eerily quiet. Jessica's arc, for instance, flirts with the possibility of regret. There are flickers, tiny, half-swallowed expressions, where she seems almost shaken by the depth of Rachel's hurt, or by the coldness with which Richard treats her once she's no longer useful. The show never goes as far as to give her a full redemption, but it leaves cracks in her villain armor. Depending on your taste, you might either wish the show had gone all the way and redeemed her, or, conversely, given up on nuance and just let her be evil. I land somewhere in the middle. I appreciate the gesture, even if it's not fully developed. Technically, there are a few rough edges. Some CGI backdrops in the glitzy industry scenes look a little fake, which can pull you out of the moment if you're sensitive to that stuff. There are also occasional continuity hiccups, a glass refilling itself between shots, a character's outfit changing slightly between cuts that might annoy nitpickers. But these are minor in the grand scheme. What matters more is that the show consistently finds a visual language for its emotional beats. Cramped frames when Rachel feels cornered. Wide-open shots when she makes a choice for herself. Warm close-ups when Sean lets down his guard. Another thing worth noting is how the drama positions gender roles. On the surface, it's very traditional. Woman sacrifices herself for family. Man protects woman with his resources. But within that, there are small subversions. Rachel is the one who initiates the marriage, who designs the contract, who decides they'll divorce later. That's a significant act of agency, even if the circumstances are desperate. Sean, for his part, spends a lot of time in what you could call feminized emotional labor, listening, soothing, learning to do chores, adjusting to her family's rhythms, especially while he's still in hiding. He's not just sweeping in as a savior from the start. He's often in the position of supporting her decisions rather than making all the calls. There's also something quietly powerful in the fact that Rachel doesn't glamorously transform overnight once the truth comes out. Yes, her clothes get a bit nicer. Yes, her circumstances improve. But the show doesn't give her a full Cinderella makeover scene where everyone gasps at her beauty for the first time. She's allowed to still be the same woman who wore cheap office clothes and cooked with bargain ingredients, just in different surroundings. The fantasy is not, you're only worthy once you look like a star's wife. It's more, you are always worthy. Now the world happens to see you standing next to someone they already valued. As the story moves along, you start to see how Sean, too, is changed by Rachel in ways that go beyond learning what real love is. Her clear moral line about how people should be treated gradually affects how he uses his regained power. Early on, when he fantasizes about confronting those who wronged her, you can sense a more vengeful streak, maybe a desire to crush them completely, to prove a point. By the time he actually has the means to do so, there's a restraint that feels influenced by her. He still lets consequences fall, but he doesn't become the monster that hurt him. That's an important distinction. It keeps the revenge arc from tipping into sheer cruelty. Here's an observation that might not be shared by everyone. I kind of love that the show allows Sean to stay a little weird. Even at the end, even when the fairy tale is in full swing, there's an oddness to him, a discomfort with crowds, a tendency to retreat, a seriousness that doesn't suddenly flip into carefree prince mode. Trauma doesn't vanish just because he falls in love. Fame's distorting effect doesn't magically reverse. He laughs more, sure. He smiles more freely. But he doesn't become a totally different person. For me, that makes the romance more touching. Rachel is not falling for a fantasy version of him. She's staying with a complicated man who will probably always be a bit of a misfit in his own world. By this point, you probably have a sense of whether this drama's particular blend of melodrama, fairy tale, and emotional sincerity is your thing. There's still a lot to unpack in terms of how the ending lands, how satisfying the final stretch feels, and what kind of aftertaste the show leaves once the last traitor has faced their fate and the contract marriage has settled into something real. The final stretch is where a lot of dramas either solidify your love for them or make you question why you invested so many hours. Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar sits in that tricky middle zone. It delivers the emotional payoffs it's been promising from the start, but not always in the most elegant way. You can feel the writers trying to juggle fan expectations, revenge, romance, family healing, industry commentary, and sometimes the balls collide mid-air. Structurally, the endgame is built around three converging tracks: Rachel and Sean's reconciliation after the identity blow-up, the complete social downfall of Richard and Jessica, and Sean's re-entry into the entertainment world on his own terms. Each of those threads is strong enough to carry a mini-drama on its own, so cramming them all into a handful of final episodes means some beats get rushed, while others linger a bit too long. If you're a viewer who lives for big, cathartic climaxes, you'll probably be riding high. If you're more into slow, carefully plotted resolution, you might find yourself wishing certain conversations had one more draft. The reconciliation arc is, for me, the most emotionally satisfying piece of the final. After the trust collapse, there's a period where Rachel and Sean exist in this painful limbo. Legally married, emotionally estranged. They're under the same roof sometimes, or forced into the same public appearances. But there's a formality, a politeness, that hurts more than outright shouting would. The show does a good job of letting that awkwardness breathe. There's a dinner where Rachel thanks Sean for something in this very stiff, formal tone, calling him Mr. Norton instead of the softer name she used before. It's brutal, precisely because he can't argue with it. He knows he broke something precious. The turning point isn't a single grand apology, but rather a sequence of smaller, almost mundane gestures. Sean starts showing up for her in ways that have nothing to do with his wealth or status. He quietly handles hospital paperwork for her grandmother, so she doesn't have to juggle it with her job. He steps in when relatives start snipping about the scandal, not by announcing who he is, but by calmly telling them they're crossing a line. He listens when she vents, even if she still keeps him at arm's length. Those actions don't erase the lie, but they re-establish his reliability in the here and now, which is arguably more important than any speech about intentions. One of the key emotional scenes in this phase happens at the hospital again. Rachel is sitting beside her grandmother's bed, updating her in vague terms about work and home, doing the thing where you censor your life to seem smoother than it is so the elder doesn't worry. Sean stands in the doorway, half visible, listening. The grandmother, perceptive as ever, notices the tension. She calls him over and, in her gentle but firm way, tells both of them that marriage is not about never making mistakes. It's about choosing each other again after the mistakes. There's this moment where Rachel looks at Sean across the bed, eyes full of hurt and history. And you can see the war inside her, every good memory versus every lie. The show doesn't make her decide right then and there, but you feel a crack open in the wall she's built. If you're wondering whether the grandmother's condition is used as emotional blackmail to force reconciliation, the answer is, sort of, but not as crudely as it could have been. The drama is very aware that her time is limited, and that creates an urgency around everything, including Rachel's choices. But it doesn't have her deliver some manipulative, promise me, you'll stay with him no matter what speech. Her focus is more on Rachel's happiness and the value of honesty. In a way, she's the one who subtly pushes both of them to stop hiding, from each other and from themselves. While all this is brewing, Richard and Jessica's world is cracking open. Their downfall is less about one huge explosion and more about a series of accumulating fissures. Richard's business deals start soaring, often in ways indirectly connected to Sean's re-emergence. Investors get nervous about associating with someone perceived as morally compromised, especially once rumors about his treatment of Rachel and his affair with Jessica start circulating. Jessica discovers that the social circles she fought so hard to access are just as quick to drop her once she's no longer attached to a rising star. The irony is that the very things they worshipped, status, image, proximity to power, become the mechanisms of their undoing. They shape their lives around how things look, and when the optics turn against them, they have nothing solid underneath. In a particularly telling scene, Jessica shows up at a family gathering, trying to act like nothing has changed, only to find that the relatives who once fawned over her now give her the same cold, judgmental looks they used to reserve for Rachel. It's not a big speechy moment, but the reversal is clear. The tide of hypocrisy has turned. Richard's reckoning is a bit more direct. At some point, he confronts Shoin, maybe believing he can cut some kind of deal or appeal to him man to man. There's a darkly satisfying symmetry in seeing him try to posture in front of someone who once ate from Rachel's hand on the street. Shoin doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. There's a world-weary calm in the way he looks at Richard, like he's realizing just how small this man is in the grand scheme of things. He doesn't threaten him with legal action or physical violence. Instead, he tells him something along the lines of, "You had everything she was willing to give you, and you threw it away because you thought you deserved more. That's a loss you'll feel long after you forget my name." It's not theatrical, but it cuts in a way no public humiliation could. Now, whether you feel that Richard and Jessica really pay enough for what they did is going to depend on how revenge-hungry you are. They suffer real consequences: social, financial, emotional. But they're not completely obliterated. The show doesn't, for example, kill them off or throw them in prison for life. In some ways, that's more realistic. In real life, people like them often land on their feet, at least partially. In the context of a heightened melodrama, though, a portion of the audience might have been expecting a more spectacular brand of karma. Personally, I like that the punishment is hefty but not cartoonish. Watching them fade into irrelevance and loneliness feels appropriately hollow. Let's shift to Shoin's professional arc, because that's where the show has a chance to say something interesting about the entertainment industry. When he first re-emerges as Shoin Norton instead of the nameless man on the street, there's a spike of media frenzy. Where has he been? Why did he disappear? Who is this mystery wife? His management and the industry at large immediately try to spin his absence into a marketable story. Maybe they want to brand it as a sabbatical to find himself. Maybe they try to bury the homelessness and play up some more palatable narrative. Shoin's conflict here is compelling. He returned to the public eye largely to stand beside Rachel and to shield her from some of the fallout of the revelation. But stepping back into that world means risking the very self he had been trying to protect when he ran away. Early on, we saw that he hated their games. Now those games are back on the table. The show gives him a series of choices: sign this contract, attend this carefully staged interview, agree to this bogus charity event, that each represent a little compromise. The tension is in how far he's willing to bend without breaking. One scene that stands out is when his team suggests using his beggar phase as PR fodder. Maybe lean into a narrative of humble star who connected with the common people, peppered with photos of him on the street. From a cold branding perspective, it's genius. From an ethical standpoint, it's gross. Shoin recoils, and you can see why. Those months of invisibility were painful and private. Turning them into a glossy campaign feels like erasing the reality of poverty and suffering he witnessed, and, to a degree, shared in favor of a redemptive fairy tale arc. The show positions his refusal as a moral stance, in line with Rachel's earlier insistence on human dignity. Of course, the industry doesn't transform overnight because one star finds his conscience. But Shoin's decision not to exploit that part of his life sets a limit. He will re-enter, but not exactly on their terms. It's a small but meaningful assertion of agency. The implication is that fame isn't inherently corrupting. It's the systems around it that are. If he can carve out a corner of that world where he gets to choose what stories are told about him, there's a chance he can live with it. In the middle of all this external noise, the show still finds moments to return to its central relationship. One of the lovelier late-game scenes happens away from the cameras, away from family, away from hospital beds. Rachel and Shoin end up back at the spot where they first had a real conversation when he was living on the street. Maybe it's a bench, maybe a particular alleyway near her workplace. The surroundings are the same cracked pavement, same faded graffiti, same street vendor in the distance. But they are entirely different people now. He's wearing clothes that actually fit and don't smell like rainwater and exhaust fumes. She carries herself with a quiet assurance she absolutely did not have in episode 1. They talk about those early days, and what's poignant is that they remember different things. She recalls how scared she was, how chaotic her life felt. He remembers tiny acts of kindness she barely registered, like offering him an extra napkin with his food or making a joke to ease her own tension. That difference highlights what each of them values. She minimizes her goodness, he clings to it. The scene doesn't end with a big kiss or a dramatic declaration. It's more like a recommitment, an acknowledgement that whatever crazy twists their story has taken, this is where the bond really started. Two lonely people sharing a moment in a place nobody else cared about. Humor hasn't been a huge part of this review so far, but there are, thankfully, pockets of lightness in the drama itself, especially as the couple settles into a more secure phase. One recurring gag is Shoin's complete ineptitude at certain basic domestic tasks. For a guy who can command a set of hundreds and hit every mark on cue, he is weirdly hopeless with things like grocery shopping or assembling flat-pack furniture. There's a whole mini-scene where he proudly brings home an expensive brand-name ingredient, only for Rachel to explain that the cheap, local version tastes better and that he just wasted money. He looks genuinely baffled, like a prince who has never stepped into a discount store. These comedic beats don't undercut the seriousness of their journey. They act more like pressure walls, reminding us that life, even in the middle of high drama, is full of silly little misunderstandings. On the subject of comedy, we should talk about how the show handles the beggar to superstar reveal in social environments beyond family and work. There are some very on-the-nose, but undeniably entertaining sequences where people who mock Shoin for his appearance now fall over themselves to praise him. Think neighbors who once told Rachel to watch out for that vagrant suddenly asking for selfies and autographs. Office colleagues who whispered about her behind her back, inviting her to fancy dinners. These scenes function as moral fables. Be careful who you mistreat, you never know their true value. They're broad, but they scratch a very old, very human itch for poetic justice. At the same time, the drama occasionally acknowledges that not all attitudes flip so neatly. Some people remain resentful. Some resent Rachel for getting lucky because she trapped a rich man. There's a brilliant little throwaway line from an aunt who mutters something like, "If I'd known he was a superstar, I would have introduced my daughter to him first," completely ignoring the idea that Shoin and Rachel's connection was forged long before any of them knew who he was. That one line captures a whole mindset. Relationships as transactions, people as resources to be allocated. It's worth pausing here to talk about the depiction of poverty and homelessness, because that's a tricky topic in any story that uses secretly rich beggar as a hook. On one level, the premise is inherently fantastical and not meant to be a realistic commentary on life on the streets. On another, once you show those streets, once you put other unhoused people around your disguised hero, you are entering a space with real-world implications. Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar walks a fine line. It doesn't linger on the stories of other homeless characters very much, which is both a blessing and a missed opportunity. It avoids turning their suffering into background scenery for a rich man's self-discovery. But it also doesn't really explore systemic causes or solutions. Shoin's time as a beggar is framed mostly as personal exile, a choice, a way to escape. That is not how homelessness works for almost everyone in reality. The show hints at this. There are glimpses of other people on the street who clearly did not choose this. Rachel's kindness extends to them too. She doesn't only help him. There's a moment where she brings extra food and distributes it, chatting briefly with a woman who's been sleeping under a bridge. Those hints suggest an awareness that poverty is not a costume. Still, the fact that the central homeless figure is secretly a multimillionaire inevitably skews the lens toward fantasy. Whether that bothers you will depend on how literally you need to take the premise. Another thing I kept coming back to is how the drama frames marriage itself. The contract set up at the beginning is purely instrumental. Marriage as performance. Marriage as bandage over a family wound. By the end, we are supposed to believe in marriage as a space of mutual truth and support. The journey from one to the other is messy and, honestly, one of the more compelling aspects of the show. Rachel goes from seeing marriage as something she has to do for other people's peace of mind to something she chooses because it aligns with her own desires. That's a big shift, even if the person at the altar remains the same. The show underlines this change with small, almost symbolic moments. Early on, Rachel wears her ring like a shield, something she shows off in front of her grandmother and hides at work. After the betrayal, she stares at that ring in her palm, wondering what any of it means. Later, when she marries Shoin, the new ring initially feels heavy, a reminder of the lie. It's only after they reconcile in truth that you see her absent-mindedly fidget with it in moments of stress, like it's become a tactile anchor to something solid in her life. No one in the story points this out explicitly, but the camera does, and it's a nice visual shorthand for her changing relationship to the institution. Family healing is another pillar of the final arc. Rachel's mother has to reckon with the ways her expectations put pressure on her daughter, even if those expectations came from a place of love. There's a scene later on where she apologizes, not in a big tearful meltdown, but in a quiet conversation over folded laundry. She admits that she was so focused on fulfilling Rachel's grandmother's wish that she didn't see how much pain Rachel was in. That recognition is important. It moves the narrative away from all older generations are the problem towards even loving people can hurt you if they don't listen. The grandmother storyline, unsurprisingly, reaches its natural conclusion near the end. Without spoiling every detail, I'll just say that her final scenes are handled with restraint. There's emotion, there are tears, but it's not milked to the point of feeling exploitative. Her last interactions with Rachel and Shoin reinforce the idea that her biggest dream wasn't a fancy wedding or a wealthy son-in-law. It was the assurance that Rachel wouldn't face the world alone. In a way, the entire premise of the show is built on that old woman's fear of her granddaughter being left behind. Whether you agree with her logic or not, the sincerity of that fear gives the story its initial thrust and its closing warmth. If you zoom out for a second and think about where this drama sits in the broader landscape of romance melodramas, it's very much part of that subgenre where class disparity, secret wealth, and contractual relationships drive the plot. You can draw lines to countless previous shows and movies that play with similar ideas. What gives Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar a bit of its own flavor is the specific combination of a missing Hollywood-level star, the Indonesian Malay-flavored family and social dynamics, and that intense emphasis on humiliation and vindication. For viewers who grew up constantly being measured against more successful relatives, or who have felt looked down on for their job, background, or income, this story hits a very particular nerve. Rachel isn't a plucky, carefree underdog. She's a tired, overburdened woman who is one crisis away from breaking at almost all times. Watching her slowly step into a life where she's cherished instead of merely tolerated is satisfying in a way that goes beyond the glitz of Shoin's status. At the same time, if you're more of a narrative purist, you might bump against how much the show leans into coincidence and heightened reality. The odds of your local beggar being the exact missing A-list actor everyone is searching for are, obviously, nil. The convenience of certain reveals, the way particular characters overhear exactly the wrong or right thing at the perfect moment, the sudden availability of resources when the plot demands it, all of that is firmly in soap operatic territory. You have to be willing to accept that language of storytelling to enjoy what the drama is offering. For me, The question isn't, is this realistic? It's, does it feel internally consistent and emotionally honest within its own heightened world? Most of the time, the answer is yes. The internal rules are, love is powerful, but not magic. Humiliation leaves scars even if you later win. Wealth can protect, but also isolate. And lies, even well-intentioned ones, carry a cost. Whenever the show sticks to those premises, it works. When it briefly abandons them for an over-the-top stunt or a logic-defying twist, you feel it, but the strong character groundwork usually pulls it back. By the time you get to those last few scenes, after the public storms have mostly passed, after the enemies have scattered, after the cameras have dimmed down, you're left with something surprisingly modest. To people in a shared space, trying to figure out what ordinary happiness looks like now that the extraordinary chaos has subsided. Those are the moments that linger more than the big set pieces. Watching Rachel wake up in a home where she's not bracing for the next insult, seeing Shoin exist without needing to perform for anyone, even just seeing them argue about something trivial like what to eat for dinner, it all contributes to a sense that, beneath the wild premise, the show really does care about the everyday texture of a relationship. There's still the question of whether the drama sticks the landing tonally. Does the final mood feel earned or too neat? And how its various messages about love, money, and self-respect stack up once you've had time to sit with them. I think in the end the drama does manage to bring those threads together in a way that feels true to the tone it set from the beginning, even if some of the resolutions arrive wrapped in convenient bows that real life would never tie so perfectly. The final mood is warm but not saccharine. It earns its optimism by making the characters work for it rather than simply waving a magic wand of stardom and declaring everything fixed. Rachel doesn't suddenly become a different person once the credits roll. She carries the scars of the betrayals and the weight of all those months of pretending. You see it in how she interacts with her mother, now more openly honest about her feelings instead of filtering everything through what will keep the peace. That growth is quiet, and it lands because the show spent so much time earlier showing us how exhausting her old patterns were. Shoin's re-entry into the industry on his terms also feels like a logical extension of everything we learned about him rather than a tacked on happy ending. He doesn't go back to being the same polished superstar the tabloids once adored. Instead, he chooses projects that let him explore some of the themes he lived through: anonymity, kindness versus performance, the emptiness of hollow fame. There is a lovely meta layer here because the drama itself is commenting on the industry that produces dramas like itself. When Shoin turns down a big budget role that would require him to play yet another version of the rich savior figure, you can almost hear the writers winking at the audience. It's a small touch, but it adds a layer of self-awareness that elevates the final beyond pure escapism. One aspect I kept reflecting on as the story wound down was how the visuals evolve in these later episodes. The color palette warms considerably. Those early harsh fluorescents and cold hospital whites give way to softer natural light filtering through windows in their shared home spaces that feel lived in rather than staged. The camera lingers longer on ordinary domestic details: a half-drunk cup of tea Rachel left on the counter, or Shoin's old battered jacket that he refuses to throw away even though he could buy 1,000 replacements. These choices ground the fairy tale in something tangible. They remind you that no matter how much money or fame enters the picture, the relationship was built on small acts of seeing each other when no one else would. That visual continuity helps the ending avoid feeling like it belongs to an entirely different show. The music too matures in the final stretch. The sweeping ballad that dominated so many emotional peaks earlier returns, but in a stripped-down acoustic version during their quieter reconciliations. It is as if the drama itself is saying we don't need the full orchestral treatment anymore, because the feelings have become real enough to stand on their own. There are also moments of complete silence that bookend key conversations, letting the actors' breathing and small gestures carry the weight. I found myself holding my own breath during one particular exchange where Rachel finally tells Shoin that she chooses him not because he is a superstar or a solution to her problems, but because the man who sat on the curb with her is the same man who stayed through all the mess that followed. The absence of score there made the vulnerability palpable. Of course, not every element receives the same level of care in the closing chapters. Some of the side characters who provided friction throughout feel a bit abandoned once their narrative purpose is fulfilled. The office colleagues who once participated in Rachel's humiliation fade into the background without much reflection on how their behavior reflected larger cultural attitudes about class and worth. It is understandable that the show wants to focus on the central couple, but a brief scene acknowledging that systemic issues don't vanish just because one woman marries would have added depth. Instead, we get a couple of quick montages showing life moving on, and while they work on a surface level, they leave some thematic loose ends that sharper writing could have tied off. This is exactly where the drama risks feeling like it prioritizes emotional catharsis over consistent world building. You sense the writers hurrying to deliver the promised destruction of the antagonists, while still leaving room for Rachel and Sean to breathe. The result is a final that satisfies on a gut level, but invites you to poke at its logic if you step back too far. For newcomers who are just looking for that classic rush of vindication and tender romance, it will probably feel complete. For those of us who overthink these things, it leaves a few what-ifs hanging in the air. Would Rachel have found her voice without Sean's eventual reveal? How much of her strength is truly hers versus borrowed from his status? The show gestures toward answers but never fully commits, and that ambiguity is both its strength and its limitation. A personal reaction that surprised me more than I expected came during one of the very last hospital sequences. I had braced myself for something manipulative given how heavily the grandmother's wish had been used as emotional leverage throughout. Instead, the scene played with genuine tenderness, focusing less on death and more on the small legacy of kindness Rachel had inherited and was now passing on. I actually had to buzz not out of frustration this time, but because it hit a nerve about my own family and the stories we tell ourselves to keep going. It is rare for a drama with this premise to sneak up on you with that kind of quiet humanity, especially after so many loud confrontations and identity twists. That moment alone bumped my overall appreciation up a notch even as other parts left me conflicted. Speaking of which, there's something I want to defend that might go against the common fan conversation I have seen bubbling up since the release. A lot of viewers online have criticized the show for relying too heavily on the secret identity trope, saying it undermines Rachel's agency and turns her arc into a passive waiting game. I actually think the opposite is true in the final analysis. The drama uses the trope to highlight how much Rachel was already doing on her own before she knew the truth. Her kindness to Sean when he was at his lowest, her refusal to kneel for Richard, her determination to give her grandmother a moment of joy, those choices were hers alone. The reveal does not grant her power, it simply removes the illusions that were hiding how strong she had been all along. If anything, the later episodes prove that her growth continues even after the fairy tale machinery kicks in. That perspective might not erase every flaw in the execution, but it reframes the central conceit as something more thoughtful than lazy wish fulfillment. Let me pivot for a second to the chemistry between the leads, because it is what ultimately sells the entire 2-hour-plus journey across all those episodes. The actors never let the larger-than-life premise swallow their performances. You believe the frustration, the tenderness, the awkward laughter, the exhausted silences. There is a particular physicality to how they share space that evolves beautifully from the early careful distance to a comfortable intimacy where Rachel will lean against Sean's shoulder without thinking twice. It is the kind of chemistry that makes you root for them even when the plot mechanics strain credibility. In a genre full of pretty faces paired for marketing, this pairing feels chosen for the way their energies complement and challenge each other. That authenticity is the glue holding the mixed elements together. If we look at themes one last time, before the full picture settles, the drama is ultimately wrestling with the idea that real love often begins in the spaces society deems worthless. Whether it is a street corner, a cramped apartment, or a hospital hallway, Those are the locations where Rachel and Shoin become themselves without performance. The superstar persona, the perfect daughter role, the wealthy fiancé fuckhead, all of those are stripped away by the end, leaving to people who have seen each other at their most raw. The fact that the show allows their love to remain a little imperfect, a little marked by past lies, is what keeps it from feeling like empty fantasy. It suggests that eternal love is not the absence of conflict, but the choice to keep choosing each other after the secrets are exposed and the enemies have fallen away. Yet even with that nuance, I cannot pretend the drama is without its blind spots, especially around class. While it pays lip service to the notion that dignity should not depend on wealth, the narrative resolution still hinges on Shoin's hidden riches solving problems that Rachel's own resilience could only mitigate. The traitors are humbled not purely by moral awakening, but by the sudden realization that they bet against the wrong powerful man. That contradiction sits at the heart of why my feelings remain mixed. I love the emotional honesty in the central relationship. I am less convinced by the larger social statement the show thinks it is making. It wants to critique the very hierarchies it ultimately celebrates when the credits roll. Many viewers will glide past that tension because the romance is so engaging, but it is worth naming if we are being honest about what this drama accomplishes and where it pulls its punches. There is also the question of pacing in the very tail end. After building so much tension around the identity reveal and the subsequent fallout, the drama spends a surprising amount of time on relatively low-stakes domestic adjustments. Some of that feels like breathing room after the storm, which I appreciated. Other stretches start to feel like the editors were reluctant to let go of scenes that could have been tightened. A particular sequence involving extended family members arguing over trivial wedding photos drags longer than it needs to, yet even there you catch glimpses of character insight that make the indulgence forgivable. It is as though the show is reminding us that life after the big drama still contains small conflicts and petty grievances. That commitment to the everyday is admirable even when it tests your patience. You can see the director's trust in the audience here. They do not rush to tie every loose end with a neat expository conversation. Instead, they let certain relationships simply evolve off screen in ways we infer from brief updates or changed behavior. Richard, for instance, disappears from the main narrative after his final confrontation, but we hear through dialogue that his company faced quiet boycotts and reputational damage. It is enough to satisfy the revenge fantasy without requiring another full scene of him groveling. Similarly, Jessica's arc trails off into a kind of humbled solitude that feels more realistic than a dramatic come-to-Jesus moment. These choices show a level of restraint that balances the earlier, more operatic sequences. Still, the industry commentary never quite reaches the depth it flirts with. Shoin's return to acting is treated more as personal redemption than a systemic critique. We get hints of the toxic pressures that drove him away 6 months earlier: manipulative managers, invasive press, predatory networking. But the show seems hesitant to indict the machine too harshly, perhaps because it is itself a product of that machine. A more critical version of this story might have explored how even a reformed superstar like Shoin remains complicit in certain power structures. Instead, the final opts for personal integrity within the system rather than trying to change the system. That is a valid choice for a character-focused melodrama, but it leaves the thematic ambition feeling only half fulfilled. As the story approaches its absolute final beats, I find myself thinking about who this drama is really for in the current streaming landscape. Newcomers to the genre will likely be swept up in the high-concept premise, the attractive cast, and the reliable emotional beats. Fans of similar titles that blend contract marriage with hidden identity tropes will find plenty of familiar comfort food mixed with just enough fresh cultural flavor from the family dynamics and setting to feel distinct. Even critics who usually roll their eyes at these stories might be surprised by the stronger acting and occasional moments of genuine insight. The drama does not reinvent the wheel, but it polishes it until it shines again for a new audience in 2026. What might turn some viewers away is the length of the internal conflicts. If you have low tolerance for repeated humiliation cycles, or for characters who take multiple episodes to communicate basic truths, you could find yourself checking out midway. The show asks for patience, especially in the middle sections, where Rachel processes her anger and Sean grapples with re-entering public life. Those stretches are where the themes breathe, but they can test your investment if you came purely for the glamour and revenge. On the other hand, if you enjoy watching characters earn their happiness through messy, honest growth, this one rewards your time. I have to admit that my own bias as someone who gravitates towards stories about underestimated people probably colors how warmly I respond to Rachel's journey. There's something cathartic about watching a woman who has spent her life shrinking herself finally take up space unapologetically. The drama captures that evolution without turning her into a flawless heroine. She still hesitates, she still worries about her family's opinions, she still has moments where old insecurities flare up. That imperfection makes her feel like someone you could know rather than an aspirational fantasy. It is one of the reasons the romance works as well as it does, because Sean falls for the real, her not an idealized version. The supporting performances also deserve more credit than they will probably receive. The actress playing the grandmother brings a lived-in wisdom that elevates every scene she is in, turning what could have been a plot device into a fully realized person with her own quiet regrets and hopes. Rachel's mother walks a difficult line between traditional expectations and maternal love, and the performance never lets her become a caricature. Even the antagonists are given just enough shading that you understand their motivations even if you despise their actions. Richard's blend of entitlement and insecurity feels rooted in a certain kind of fragile masculinity that the drama observes without excusing. These layers prevent the show from feeling like pure good versus evil theater. When it comes to the technical side, the editing in the final episodes deserves praise for how it intercuts between the public spectacle of Sean's comeback and the private moments that actually matter to the couple. One sequence jumps from a flashy press conference where Sean fields questions about his disappearance to a simple shot of him later removing his tie and exhaling the car while Rachel waits for him at home. The contrast is sharp and effective. It reminds you that the glittering world he is rejoining is not the one that defines their bond. The sound design mirrors this by letting ambient noises of their everyday life, the distant traffic hum of the refrigerator, dominate the quieter scenes, while the public moments are awash in camera clicks and overlapping voices. Those choices show a director who understands that scale is not the same as substance. If I had one creative wish, it would be that the drama had trusted its audience enough to end on a slightly more open note. The very last scene wraps things up perhaps a touch too completely, with everyone in their right place, and the future looking unambiguously bright. A hint of ongoing struggle or a final quiet acknowledgement that life will keep testing them might have made the conclusion feel less like the end of a story and more like the beginning of a real marriage. Still, what we get is warm and satisfying in its own way, a gentle reminder that sometimes the person you thought was there to play a temporary role turns out to be the one who stays. There is one final layer I want to explore before we land on an overall verdict, and that is how the drama uses the Christmas deadline established early on as both a ticking clock and a symbolic frame. The grandmother's desire to see Rachel married before the holiday infuses the entire narrative with a sense of seasonal urgency and renewal. Early episodes lean into the pressure of that deadline with festive decorations, contrasting Rachel's inner turmoil in ways that heighten the emotional stakes. By the final, the holiday has come and gone, yet its spirit lingers in the theme of second chances and chosen family. The show could have overdone the metaphor, turning every snowfall or string of lights into heavy-handed symbolism, but instead it stays light, letting the audience draw the connections. That restraint is part of what makes the resolution feel earned rather than manufactured. You might be wondering at this point how we would compare it to other recent releases that play in similar sandboxes. Without naming specific titles that were not provided in the input, it is fair to say that Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar distinguishes itself through its commitment to the female-led's interior life in ways that some faster-paced rivals gloss over. Where other stories might race from contract signing to grand gesture, this one pauses to show the daily negotiations that turn a fake marriage into something authentic. That slower heartbeat will not appeal to everyone, but for those willing to settle in it creates a richer payoff. The acting elevates material that in lesser hands could have felt formulaic, turning familiar beats into something that lingers with you days after the final episode. Of course, no long-form review like this would be complete without acknowledging that my own viewing experience was shaped by watching it in chunks rather than all at once. The serialized nature of the drama rewards that approach because each episode builds on small emotional shifts that accumulate power over time. Binging might flatten some of the tension, especially around Rachel's gradual forgiveness. If you are new to the show, I would actually recommend spacing it out a bit, letting the quieter domestic scenes breathe before diving into the next round of external conflict. That rhythm mirrors the story's own movement from chaos to calm and back again, and it lets the themes settle properly. The more I reflect on it, the more I realize that the drama's greatest success is how it makes the fantastical premise feel emotionally grounded. A superstar pretending to be a beggar, a contract marriage born of desperation, a dying grandmother's wish, all of it could have been ridiculous. Instead, the show anchors every wild twist in recognizable human needs, the need to be seen, the need to protect the people we love, the need to reclaim dignity after being stripped of it. That foundation is what allows even the most melodramatic moments to resonate. When Shoin finally stands fully revealed, not just as a celebrity, but as someone who has chosen honesty, the catharsis is real because we have walked every step of the deception with him. There are still a few nagging questions the show never fully answers, such as how Rachel's workplace and social circle adjust to her new reality long-term, or whether Shoin's old industry enemies might resurface in a sequel bait kind of way. Those gaps are minor, though compared to what it does deliver. The core relationship arc feels complete, the antagonists receive consequences proportional to their actions, and the central themes are given enough airtime to matter. For a drama that could easily have coasted on its high-concept title, Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar puts in the work to earn its emotional highs, and that effort is visible in nearly every frame of the final stretch. As we near the close of this very long conversation about the show, I want to circle back to something I mentioned right at the start: the strange, messy appeal of watching a woman walk away from humiliation and into an unexpected partnership with someone the world dismissed. That image stays with me because it captures both the fantasy and the reality the drama is selling. The fantasy is that the person who saw your worth when you had nothing will turn out to have the power to rewrite your story. The reality is that rewriting the story still requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths together. Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar balances those two sides better than it has any right to, given how outrageous its log line sounds on paper. It is not perfect. It stumbles in places where it prioritizes spectacle over sense. But its heart is in the right place, and its best moments genuinely moved me in ways I did not anticipate when I first hit play. So where does that leave us in terms of recommendation? For newcomers who have never dipped their toes into this particular corner of romance melodrama, this could be an accessible and ultimately uplifting entry point, provided you can embrace the heightened logic. It introduces the tropes without feeling like it is checking boxes, and it gives you characters worth caring about beyond their roles in the plot. Fans of the genre will find enough fresh spins on familiar ideas to justify the runtime, while critics might appreciate the stronger performances and occasional thematic ambition, even as they note the places where it plays it safe. If you are in the mood for something that delivers both cathartic revenge and tender domesticity with a side of celebrity satire, then this drama is worth your time. If, however, you need airtight plotting or a more radical critique of wealth and fame, you may end up frustrated by its compromises. The truth is, no single drama can satisfy every possible viewer, and Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar knows what kind of story it wants to tell. It wants to comfort you with the idea that kindness is never wasted, that lies can be forgiven when they come from fear rather than malice, and that love can bloom in the unlikeliest soil. It delivers that comfort with style flair and enough emotional honesty to make the fantasy feel personal. Whether that is enough for you will depend on what you bring to the watch. But speaking as someone who has now spent considerable time living inside this world, I can say it left me thinking about my own life and relationships in ways that surprised me. That is the highest compliment I can give any story, even one as over the top as this. There is one last small thing that keeps circling in my mind as I finish processing the entire experience, and it has to do with how the drama portrays the passage of time after the main conflicts resolve. Rather than jumping straight to a flash forward with babies and awards ceremonies, it lingers in the immediate aftermath, letting us see Rachel and Sean navigate the first few weeks of their real marriage. Those scenes are not flashy. They show arguments about trivial things, moments of doubt, late-night talks, where they revisit old wounds, and the slow rebuilding of trust. I found that approach incredibly respectful to the characters and to the audience. It says that even after the credits roll, life continues with all its imperfections, and that is where the real love story lives, not in the grand gestures, but in the choice to keep showing up. This extended reflection has taken us through premise, character arcs, performances, visuals, music themes, personal reactions, and cultural positioning. But there is always more to say when a drama burrows this deeply under your skin. The way the supporting cast evolves in subtle ways during the final, for instance, or how certain recurring symbols, like the simple coffee cups from their first night together, reappear at key moments to signal continuity. Those details reward rewatches and conversations like this one. They turn what could have been disposable entertainment into something that sparks genuine discussion about dignity, trust, and what we owe the people who see us when we are invisible. And yet, as much as I have praised the nuance, there remains that persistent mixed feeling about the class politics that never quite resolves itself, no matter how many times I turn it over in my head. The drama wants us to believe that Rachel's kindness would have been rewarded even without Sean's wealth, but the plot mechanics make his wealth the catalyst for her freedom. It is a contradiction that sits uncomfortably alongside the otherwise empathetic storytelling. Perhaps that is why the overall stance lands in mixed territory for me. I can celebrate the human connections and the acting while still wishing the show had found a way to empower Rachel more independently before bringing the superstar element back into play. That wish does not ruin the experience, but it does color the aftertaste. If you have made it this far through this deep dive, thank you for spending so much time with me and with Suamiku Pengemis Ternyata Superstar. These long-form conversations are why I do what I do on Flick Flare, because dramas like this deserve more than a quick thumbs up or thumbs down. They deserve to be unpacked, their contradictions examined, their strengths celebrated, and their flaws named with respect. If this review has sparked any thoughts of your own about Rachel and Sean, or about how we treat people based on appearances, drop them in the comments. I read every single one, and I love hearing where your opinions differ from mine. If you are new here, and you enjoy thoughtful spoiler-filled breakdowns of dramas that make you feel everything, consider subscribing, so we can do this again with the next release that catches my eye. Until then, take care of yourselves, watch something that moves you, and remember that sometimes the person the world calls a beggar is carrying a story richer than you could ever imagine.